Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Out of the blue came this disease, a thing more frightful than any disaster whatever, Dionysius of Alexandria. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, your host for this podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. If you are listening to the audio podcast version, you can actually go over to YouTube right now and check out this episode with a video companion that goes along with the podcast. So you can get a little bit of a multimedia experience, and make sure when you go over there to click subscribe, ring the bell, and like this video so that you get more of this videos and we get noticed by the algorithms. We're trying to reach over 1,000 subscribers right now. That would be awesome if you could support us that way. And I really appreciate you listening today. So today's tale goes back to one of the earliest topics I covered in the podcast. I wanted to revisit it partly because we now know in a much more personal way what it feels like to live through a pandemic. I think that experiences make it easier for us to understand why the Plague of Cyprian hit the Roman world with such force, and maybe we can connect with an ancient pandemic just a little bit closer. I also want to revisit it because there's been some new important information and research that's come about since I recorded this episode the first time. We all have some new perspectives on having lived through our very own global pandemic. First, let's get into some of the possible epidemiological causes of this pandemic. Scholars don't know for sure what caused this terrible affliction, but instead of this disaster being named after the disease, it is named after a churchman who just mentioned it, Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage in North Africa. This is really an unfortunate name for the plague. You get the impression that either Cyprian or the Christians were the ones who were spreading this deadly affliction. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, however, was simply the first person to document the pandemic that broke loose in the early 250s. So he gets the honor of having the plague named after him. Also, just as a caveat going forward, I'm going to be speaking about some of these medical issues, but I'm not a medical professional, so I will only speak about these medical issues in the broadest way. And if I somehow misrepresent some of the medical evidence, hold me responsible for that, not the sources that I use. Now, contemporary sources say that up to 5,000 people per day died in the city of Athens. This number is likely represented in other major cities as well, including Carthage and Alexandria. When we look at why the demographics of the Roman Empire collapsed in the early 200s and why the Roman Empire could have easily ended in the 300s, we see that these afflictions are very likely a cause, or at least an additive cause, you might say. When I originally recorded this episode over 10 years ago, the leading thought was that the Plague of Cyprian was more than likely caused by either measles or smallpox. Many scholars continue to hold that smallpox or measles as a likely culprit, but recent scholarship in archaeology are pointing to other diseases as more likely. Cyprian of Carthage wrote a long treatise on the disease and the affliction called On the Mortality, which gives a short description of the symptoms of the disease. The main focus of On the Mortality is not an eyewitness reporting or an epidemiological study, but more of a sermon on how bad things happen all the time. There are famines, wars, persecutions, and even plagues. That being said, he does get into somewhat of a nitty-gritty description on the disease. Here's a direct quote from Cyprian's On the Mortality. These are adduced as proof of faith that, as the strength of the body is dissolved, the bowels dissipate in a flow, that a fire that begins in the inmost depths burns up into wounds in the throat, that the intestines are shaken with continuous vomiting, that the eyes are set on fire from the force of the blood, that the infection of the deadly putrefaction cuts off the feet or other extremities of some, and that as weakness prevails through the failures and losses of the body, the gait is crippled, or the hearing is blocked, or the vision is blinded. End quote. This is not really a description of measles or smallpox or even bubonic plague in general. Some of the symptoms line up with other diseases, but not entirely. In addition, these diseases, such as smallpox and bubonic plague, even measles, were well known enough at the time, at least enough that people at the time would have been able to describe them in a fairly accurate and recognizable way. That is why scholars led by University of Oklahoma classicist Kyle Harper believe the disease was something more likely to be a version of a hemorrhagic fever or a zoonotic influenza virus, something maybe reminiscent of the Spanish flu or maybe even Ebola itself. I read a popular article by Professor Harper in The Atlantic, which was based on an academic article he wrote and a more detailed book. I am reading the book and will possibly even do a deep dive on the book because I'm fascinated by disease, especially in the ancient world. Again, caveat time, I am not in any way trained in epidemiology, health sciences, or anything medical whatsoever, but I have read fairly widely on the topic of infectious disease, even before the COVID pandemic. I will say Harper's arguments are compelling even to a novice such as myself. The big argument that others would say against Ebola or a similar hemorrhagic fever, and to me, it makes sense in a way, is if we look in the modern era, we see that there have been Ebola epidemics very recently as the 2016-2018 time period in Africa, but south of the sub-Saharan Africa, you might say, the area south of Carthage and Alexandria. And what we see from those pandemics is that Ebola burns out very quickly. It just kills victims too quickly to spread too far. Ebola typically has a much higher mortality rate as well, especially for caretakers, which was we'll get into caretakers and mortality in just a few minutes. But generally, Ebola starts at about a 50% mortality rate and can go up into the 90s. And this idea will definitely progress and build as we go on. The quote from the beginning of the episode by Dionysius, Pope of Alexandria, says it all culturally, at least. This plague just seemed to drop onto the scene out of the clear blue sky, which is also a big indicator towards the hemorrhagic fever camp being correct. It is possible that either of these new afflictions or a modified form of some hemorrhagic fever or zoonotic disease may have been the issue. So people didn't have any natural immunities to these diseases. So one day people just started to die. They would break out in horrible blisters all over their body. They would die. And then other members of their household, neighbors and friends would start to get those same systems, bleeding out of their eyes, bleeding out of places you don't want to be bleeding from. Now, not to get too far into the weeds, but the zoonotic Spanish flu type virus would also seem to be a good candidate for the Plague of Cyprian, especially if it was a novel strain. We have seen that viruses that jump from animals to humans, back to animals, back and forth can hit a society extremely rapidly. Alas, for all the speculation of experts and novices such as myself, there will likely never be an answer to this just because there's just no way to really prove it. But going back to Cyprian, he goes on to say that the end time spoken of in the scriptures, of which he quotes at length, must be coming very soon because of all the terrible things that were happening. It probably wasn't much of a stretch to think the end of the world was nigh if you were in his shoes. The empire was in a constant state of warfare and civil war. There were crop failures. The Decian persecution was in full swing. And then a devastating plague hits completely out of nowhere, which killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population. A 50% fatality rate is on the high range of these estimates given by scholars, but it isn't outside of the realm of possibilities that localized numbers could have been that high or even higher, especially if we look at the bubonic plague, which would hit millennium later, or the Justinian plague that would just come down the road about 200-ish years later.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolfe. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
And who can really blame Cyprian for thinking a revelation of St. John, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse style end of days was happening? By Cyprian's estimation, though, this wasn't a bad thing necessarily. If the end of days was coming, that meant that the second coming was also just around the corner. Even if the second coming of Christ wasn't happening, what's the big deal of dying anyways? If you die, you had the opportunity to go to heaven. Where's the downside with that? Cyprian would say, just don't lose your faith and everything else will work itself out. Overall, the writings of Dionysius of Alexandria and Cyprian of Carthage are really upbeat and positive. This is not the case with pagans, though. Just to keep in mind, much of what we know about the pagan response to the plague is based on the writings of Christian writers, so we'll take that with a grain of salt, obviously. Generally, the pagans viewed everything that was going on as the end of the world, too, except in a bad way. This is a major theme and may have been one reason why Christianity came out in a stronger position than it began after the plague. Dionysius of Alexandria said that the pagans would throw a sick family member out of the house and would not treat an afflicted person and wouldn't even bury their dead, but instead just leave them out in the street. And we can take a little bit of a look into the various responses to the affliction, at least if you take it with a grain of salt. The pagan response of just avoid this deadly contagion or affliction, whereas the Christian response, fulfill your religious duty. You're risking your salvation if you're uncharitable. And here's a little quote directly from Dionysius of Alexandria. Quote, at the first onset of the disease, insert here the pagans, pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treated unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they might, they found it difficult to escape, end quote. The Christians, on the other hand, were encouraged to nurse and minister to the sick. I can see some out there rolling their eyes and saying this is just after the fact, Christian claptrap bashing those pagans. But even pagan writers notice that these early Christians were exercising much more charity during this plague than the pagan religions were. About 100 years later, the Emperor Julian the Apostate, that is, tried to reform the pagan religions by having them copy Christian charitable acts and Christian charitable organizations. He is even quoted as saying that the impious Galileans, that's what he called the Christians, gave charity and helped their own needy and the pagan needy as well. At a fundamental level, Christians were called on to be charitable, and if they were not, they were seriously risking offending their God. The pagans were not called to charity by religious obligation. The Greco-Roman deities could care less about charity and all that. All the pagan gods really cared about was that the sacrifices were conducted regularly and in the proper manner. As we've seen, not sacrificing really got under Romans' skin, not sacrificing to their gods. Also, a pagan didn't risk their salvation or afterlife by not helping out another person or engaging in charitable deeds as the Christians did. And obviously, you would get into we could certainly argue about works and the necessity of works towards salvation, but Christians were clearly called upon to love thy neighbor, and that's really hard to deny. Whether they directly thought that there was a connection to a salvation, that's a different argument for a different episode. We talked about it in a little bit more depth in the earlier episode, but there was a scholar, Rodney Stark, and he wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, where he lays out a theoretical situation. First, he relates that modern medical experts estimate that the treatment of the symptoms of diseases could lower the fatality rate, possibly significantly lowering the mortality rate in some cases. Stark, in turn, relies heavily on a book by William MacLeod called Plagues and Peoples to support his medical claims. Stark, who was a sociologist of religion, tried to take a scientific and mathematical approach to ancient demographics, which is a tall order, and the amount of liberties that have to be taken with mathematics when you really have no data to support it's stretching it. But in short, his theory is that if Christians had taken a minimal care of their victims and the mortality of the disease for them went down even just a few %, the demographics of the Roman Empire could have radically changed very quickly. Within 100 years, Christians could have gone from less than 0.5% of the population of, say, a certain geographic region So in the 260s to up to 25% of the population just 100 years later. That kind of demographic shift can't be ignored. Massive shifts in population like this one cause huge changes in the whole culture of an area. This effect would have been much more pronounced in the cities than in the rural areas, which obviously would have been more influential on society. On top of all that, the Christian population that came out of the plague would have had a higher percentage of people who would have natural immunity to whatever disease caused the plague. Stark thinks all of these factors would have definitely made an impact on the pagan population and could have possibly increased conversion rates even higher. He even, Stark that is, goes a step further and says that if the empire hadn't been hit by all these plagues, Christianity may have never had the numbers in absolute or percentage terms to become the most important religious movement in the empire by, say, the 4th century. So that's a big claim. Now, as we wrap up here with this episode, I think one of the most striking things about the Plague of Cyprian is not just the question of what disease this was, but how people understood what was happening to them. For Cyprian and his world, this was not just a medical crisis. This was a moment where everything familiar seemed to be breaking down. War, famine, persecution, and now pestilence. What he saw was not a temporary disruption, but something much deeper, something that revealed what people really believed and how they were going to respond. And I think how we connect to pandemics of the past is different for us today than it might have been just a few short years ago. We all lived through this COVID-19 pandemic, and we're still really living with the after effects to this very day. Even if you're not listening to this in the time that it was published, this episode, we'll be living with the fallout from the pandemic for decades to come. And the pandemic showed us where a time of normal life was just suddenly and incredibly interrupted, where our routines disappeared and where people were trying to make sense of something that just didn't have easy answers. But here's why Cyprian feels different to us as well. Cyprian was not trying to figure out how to get back to normal. He did not assume that normal was coming back at all. Instead, he asked a different question. If the world is changing, if suffering and death are right in front of us, what does that demand of us? How do we live? How do we treat one another? What do we really believe when it matters the most? And his answer was not fear. It was faith, courage, and the care for others, even if it was at great cost. We tend to ask, what was the disease? Was it smallpox? Was it this? Was it that? Cyprian asked, what did the disease mean? We tend to look for a return to normal. I know myself, I wanted to get back to normal, but Cyprian was preparing people to live faithfully, even if normal was gone. And obviously his normal is a lot different than our normal. And maybe that's why this episode came to my mind as one to revisit and think about and ponder a little bit. And hopefully it helps you ponder too, not because we can solve the mystery of the Plague of Cyprian, but because we can see in Cyprian's response a very different way of understanding a world that was turned upside down. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, or just want to reflect a little bit on maybe some comparisons and some contrasts to this Plague of Cyprian and to our own pandemic that we lived through, I'd love to hear them. Leave them in the chat on YouTube, Spotify, or your podcatcher of choice. Please also leave a thumbs up and even share this video if you think of it. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolfe. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center may not be available in all states, not available in California.